The clock on the wall of courtroom 3C ticked past 4:30 p.m., each second a hammer blow against the strained silence. The air, thick with the scent of stale coffee and anxious perspiration, hung heavy. Judge Alana Merryweather, her black robe a stark contrast against the pale oak of her chair, adjusted her glasses, a barely perceptible sigh escaping her lips. Another delay. Just another delay, she thought, the words a bitter mantra against the rising tide of frustration. Another crack in the already fractured facade of justice. Her gaze swept across the courtroom, noting the impatient shuffling of feet, the stifled yawns, the lawyers' whispering hurried consultations. Each face was a story, a life momentarily suspended in the limbo of legal proceedings. And for what? She wondered, the question a familiar ache in her chest. For another petty drug possession case? Another cog in the broken machine? The heavy courtroom doors swung open with a theatrical creak, drawing all eyes towards the entrance. Officer Rick Holstead, a man built like a bulldozer, strode in, his uniform straining against his thick frame. His presence filled the room, not just physically, but with an aura of self-importance that grated on Judge Merryweather's nerves. He moved with a deliberate slowness, a swagger that suggested he owned the space, the proceedings, the very air they breathed. Showmanship, she thought, her lips tightening into a thin line, as if this were some kind of performance. She watched, her expression carefully neutral, as Holstead approached the witness stand, his heavy boots echoing on the polished floor. "Please take the stand, Officer Holstead," Judge Merryweather said, her voice calm and measured, betraying none of the simmering irritation within. Her hand rested lightly on the gavel, a small, wooden island of control in the chaotic sea of the courtroom. Holstead's acknowledgement was a curt nod, his eyes sweeping over her with an almost dismissive glance. He settled into the witness stand with a sigh that seemed to convey his boredom with the entire process. The casual disrespect, the blatant disregard for the sanctity of the court, it fueled the quiet fire that burned within her. He thinks this is beneath him, she realized, the thought a cold, hard pebble in her gut. He thinks I am beneath him. District Attorney Baldwin, a man whose ambition often outweighed his competence, began his questioning. The routine questions and answers droned on, a predictable script playing out in the stale air of the courtroom. Judge Merryweather listened, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The case itself was unremarkable, a small-time drug possession charge that would likely result in a slap on the wrist. But it was more than just this case, wasn't it? It was the accumulation of years, decades, even of similar cases of systemic failures, of injustices both small and large. This case was a symptom, a festering wound on the body of a broken system. Did the defendant give you verbal consent to search her vehicle, Officer Holstead? Judge Merryweather asked, her voice cutting through the monotonous drone of the proceedings. The question, seemingly innocuous, was a carefully placed trap. She had reviewed the arrest report. There was no mention of verbal consent. Holstead shifted in his seat, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "She did not give it," he replied, his tone laced with a subtle defiance. Judge Merryweather's grip tightened on the gavel. The answer, evasive and dismissive, was precisely what she had expected. He thinks he can get away with this, she thought, the fire within her now a steady blaze. He thinks he's above the law. Years of witnessing such arrogance, such casual disregard for the rights of the accused, had hardened her resolve. She had documented countless instances of police misconduct, compiling a silent dossier of abuses, waiting for the right moment, the right catalyst. The courtroom held its breath. The air crackled with unspoken tension. District Attorney Baldwin, oblivious to the undercurrents swirling around him, fumbled with his notes, a confused frown creasing his brow. The young bailiff, his face pale, stood frozen, caught in the crossfire of unspoken hostility. He was young, barely out of the academy, his idealism not yet tarnished by the realities of the system. Judge Merryweather saw his fear, his uncertainty, and felt a pang of sympathy. He was a pawn in this game, just as the defendant was, just as, in a way, she herself was. But not anymore, she vowed silently. This ends now. The thought was a steel rod in her spine, strengthening her resolve. The slap, when it came, was sudden, shocking. A sharp crack that echoed through the stunned silence of the courtroom. It was not the force of the blow itself, but the sheer audacity of it, the blatant disrespect for the court, for the law, for her very being, that sent a wave of cold fury washing over her. In that moment, something within her shifted. The years of suppressed anger, of carefully documented injustices, of quiet resignation, coalesced into a single, unwavering purpose. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Gasps, shouts, the frantic scrambling of feet. But amidst the pandemonium, Judge Merryweather remained eerily still, her face a mask of controlled fury. The slap, a physical manifestation of the systemic rut she had witnessed for so long, had become a turning point. It was no longer just about this case, this officer, this courtroom. It was about dismantling the entire corrupt edifice, brick by agonizing brick. The fight had begun. The fluorescent lights of the courtroom hummed, a monotonous drone that seemed to amplify the silence hanging heavy in the air. Judge Merryweather adjusted her robe, the crisp fabric a stark contrast to the rising heat she felt beneath her skin. Holstead's presence, a solid, imposing mass, radiated a simmering resentment that she recognized all too well. It was the simmer before the boil, the quiet tension that preceded an eruption. He underestimated me, she thought, her gaze steady on the officer. He thinks this is just another day, another case. But today was different. Today the scales would tip. District Attorney Baldwin, oblivious to the undercurrents swirling in the courtroom, continued his questioning. Officer Holstead, can you explain the discrepancy between your written report and the defendant's testimony regarding the location of the arrest? His voice was smooth, practiced, tinged with a hint of boredom. He'd handled hundreds of these cases, each blurring into the next. He hadn't yet grasped the significance of the missing minutes from Holstead's body camera footage, the same kind of omission she'd seen time and time again. Blind spots, she thought, her fingers tightening on the gavel. Willful or not, they all lead to the same place. Holstead shifted his weight, the movement almost imperceptible, yet it spoke volumes. Unease pricked at him, a flicker of annoyance that he couldn't quite suppress. My report is accurate, he stated, his voice flat, devoid of inflection. He avoided the judge's eyes, focusing instead on a point somewhere over Baldwin's shoulder. He knew the missing footage was a problem, a chink in his carefully constructed narrative. He'd dealt with similar situations before, relying on his reputation, his imposing physique, to intimidate in silence. They'll back down, he told himself. They always do. Yet the defendant claims he was apprehended 2 blocks away from the location you specified. A significant difference, wouldn't you agree, officer? Baldwin's tone remained neutral, but a hint of curiosity had crept into his voice. He was starting to see the cracks, the inconsistencies that pointed to something deeper. The defendant is a known drug user, Holstead retorted, his voice laced with a dismissive edge. His recollection of events is likely impaired. He glanced at Judge Merryweather, a fleeting, challenging look. He expected her to intervene, to shut down this line of questioning. He expected deference. Judge Merryweather's voice, when she spoke, was calm, measured. Officer Holstead, your training clearly outlines the importance of accurate reporting. Can you explain why this discrepancy exists? Inside, a quiet fire burned. This wasn't just about the defendant. It was about a pattern, a system that allowed officers like Holstead to operate with impunity. This ends now, she vowed silently. Your training is flawed, Holstead muttered under his breath, the words barely audible. But the courtroom was silent enough, the tension thick enough for everyone to hear. What's that supposed to mean? Baldwin asked, his voice sharper now, finally registering the disrespect. It means, Holstead said, his voice rising, that we're out there dealing with these criminals every day, and we don't have time for all this bureaucratic nonsense. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. The arrogance, radiating from him was almost palpable. This court takes gaps in police footage very seriously, Officer Holstead, Judge Merryweather stated, her voice still controlled, but with an underlying steel. Especially when those gaps coincide with accusations of misconduct. You're accusing me of lying. Holstead's face flushed crimson. He felt the familiar surge of anger, the loss of control that always seemed to bubble to the surface when he was challenged. Judge Merryweather met his gaze, unflinching. I don't appreciate being accused in my own courtroom, officer. Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. The bailiff, a young man with barely a year on the job, shifted nervously from foot to foot, his eyes darting between the judge and the officer. He could feel the electricity in the room, the palpable sense of impending disaster. He wished he were anywhere else. Holstead's chest heaved. The years of unchecked power, the ingrained belief in his own invincibility, warred with the rising fear that he'd finally gone too far. But the anger, the humiliation, consumed him. He stood up abruptly, the scrape of his chair against the floor echoing in the sudden silence. Before anyone could react, before he himself could fully process what he was doing, his hand lashed out. A sharp crack split the air. Judge Merryweather's head snapped back, her hand flying to her cheek. The courtroom erupted in a cacophony of gasps and shouts. The bailiff, finally finding his voice, yelled, "Order! Order in the court!" But the words seemed to hang suspended in the air, powerless against the shockwave that rippled through the room. Holstead stood frozen, his hands still outstretched, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. He stared at Judge Merryweather, at the red mark blooming on her dark skin, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt a flicker of fear. What have I done? The thought echoed in the sudden, deafening silence of his own mind. The simmer had finally boiled over. The crack echoed, a stark, brutal sound that seemed to suck the very air from the courtroom. A collective gasp, a strangled intake of breath, rippled through the gallery. Time fractured, splintering into 1,000 sharp, crystalline shards. In the sudden, suffocating silence, Alana Merryweather felt a strange detachment, as if observing herself from a distant, elevated perspective. Her cheek throbbed, a dull, insistent pulse against the lingering phantom pressure of Holstead's hand. She tasted blood, a metallic tang on her tongue. Disgusting, she thought, the word echoing the visceral revulsion that coiled in her stomach. This wasn't just an assault on her. It was an assault on the very foundation of law and order, a blatant disregard for the sanctity of the court. Years of carefully constructed composure threatened to crumble, yet a steely resolve hardened within her. This wasn't defeat. This was opportunity. Rick Holstead, chest heaving, stood frozen, the residue of his rage still clinging to him like a second skin. He saw the shock in the eyes of the DEA, the horrified expressions of the courtroom spectators, the sheer disbelief etched on the young bailiff's face. A flicker of unease, a prickle of doubt, momentarily disrupted his self-assured facade. He'd expected fear, submission, the usual cowering before his authority. He hadn't expected this unnerving stillness, this pregnant silence that seemed to amplify the weight of his actions. They wouldn't dare, a voice whispered in his mind, a desperate attempt to cling to the illusion of his inviolability. He was a cop, a symbol of law enforcement. They wouldn't touch him. District Attorney Baldwin felt a cold dread seep into his bones. He'd seen Holstead's temper before, the barely contained aggression simmering beneath his surface, but he'd always dismissed it, rationalized it as the byproduct of a stressful job. He'd been wrong, terribly wrong. The slap wasn't just a lapse in judgment. It was a seismic shift, a blatant display of power gone unchecked. He looked at Judge Merryweather, her composure unsettling, almost unnerving in the face of such blatant disrespect. What would she do? What did she do? He'd known her for years, admired her unwavering commitment to justice. But this was different. This was personal. He swallowed, the silence pressing down on him, heavy and suffocating. The young bailiff, barely out of the academy, stare at the scene unfolding before him, his mind struggling to process the sheer audacity of what he'd just witnessed. He'd envisioned courtroom dramas, tense exchanges, even outbursts, but never this. Officer Holstead, a figure of authority, had just assaulted a judge. His training, his ingrained respect for the hierarchy, warred with the stark reality of the situation. His hand instinctively went to his taser, his fingers twitching. He had a duty, a responsibility, but the sheer magnitude of the moment paralyzed him. He felt a tremor run through his body, the weight of expectation suddenly crushing. He was just a rookie, caught in a whirlwind he hadn't anticipated, a storm that threatened to consume everything in its path. Breaking the suffocating silence, Judge Merryweather's voice, calm yet resonant, cut through the tension. "Thank you," she said, her gaze fixed on Holstead. Each word was measured, deliberate, carrying the weight of years of frustration, of battles fought in the shadows. "You just exposed everything I've been fighting to prove." Internally, a storm raged. The humiliation, the sting of the blow, the raw injustice of it was all there, a chaotic jumble of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Yet beneath it all, a cold, hard clarity emerged. This wasn't just about her. This was about every marginalized voice silenced, every injustice swept under the rug. This was about change. Holstead stared at her, his eyes narrowed, a flicker of fear finally igniting in their depths. "I'm a cop," he growled, his voice laced with a desperate attempt to reclaim his authority. "You don't arrest a cop in a courtroom." He clung to the words like a lifeline, a desperate plea to the unwritten rules, the unspoken code of protection that had shielded him for so long. He could feel the ground shifting beneath his feet, the familiar landscape of power and privilege beginning to crumble. The bailiff, finally galvanized into action, stepped forward, his voice surprisingly firm despite the tremor in his hands. "You assaulted a judge," he stated, his eyes meeting Holstead's. "You're under arrest." The words, once a rote part of his training, now carried the weight of a turning tide. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. He was a small cog in a vast machine, yet in this moment, his actions held immense significance. Judge Merryweather watched as Holstead was led away, his bluster replaced by a stunned silence. "You don't get to hide behind your badge anymore," she said, her voice low but unwavering. The words weren't just directed at Holstead. They were a declaration, a message to the system that had protected him, a promise of accountability. The silence that followed was different now, no longer suffocating but pregnant with anticipation, with the promise of change. The courtroom doors swung shut, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. But the ripple effects of that single act of violence were already spreading, radiating outwards, carried on whispers and hushed conversations. Within minutes, the story began to circulate, gaining momentum, fueled by outrage and disbelief. Social media erupted, hashtags trending, videos shared and reshared, each click amplifying the message, each comment adding to the chorus of voices demanding justice. News outlets picked up the story, the headlines stark and unforgiving. The slap, a single moment of unchecked aggression, became a symbol, a catalyst, a tipping point in a system teetering on the edge of change. Judge Merryweather, once a respected figure within the confines of the legal system, was now thrust into the national spotlight. Her quiet strength and unwavering resolve captivating a nation yearning for justice. The fluorescent lights of the courthouse hallway buzzed, a counterpoint to the silence that had fallen. Alana Merryweather, her hand still tingling where Holstead's palm had connected, walked with measured steps, each one a conscious effort to maintain her composure. The bailiff, a young man barely out of his teens, trailed behind her, his face a mask of shock. Alana could feel his gaze, heavy with unspoken questions, but she offered no explanation. Her mind was a whirlwind, thoughts colliding like storm clouds. "Not here," she thought, pressing a hand to her temple. "Not like this." The sting wasn't just physical. It was the blatant disrespect, the casual brutality in front of a courtroom full of people. It was the weight of every injustice she'd witnessed, every whispered complaint dismissed, every life unfairly altered by the very system she was sworn to uphold. Reaching her chambers, Alana closed the door, the heavy click echoing the finality of the moment. The silence, broken only by the hum of the air conditioner, felt oppressive. She leaned against the cool wood of the door, closing her eyes. This wasn't just about her. It was about every young black man hauled into her courtroom on flimsy charges, every woman whose cries for help were ignored, every family torn apart by a system designed to keep them down. This changes everything, a voice whispered in her mind. This is the breaking point. The initial shock gave way to a steely resolve. This wasn't the end, it was the catalyst. Years of meticulously documented cases, whispered conversations with community leaders, painstakingly gathered evidence, it all converged on this single act of violence. Alana opened her eyes, a new fire burning within them. She walked to her desk, the polished surface reflecting her determined expression. She pulled out her phone, her fingers moving with a newfound purpose. News of the incident spread like wildfire. Within hours, grainy cell phone footage of the slap was circulating online, each view adding fuel to the growing outrage. The local news stations picked up the story, followed by national outlets. The hashtag #JusticeForJed trended, voices rising in a chorus of disbelief and anger. Alana spent the next few days fielding calls from her superiors, from community leaders, from journalists wanting a statement. She chose her words carefully, each sentence measured, each utterance a carefully placed stone in the foundation of the change she envisioned. "This isn't the end," she told a local reporter, her voice calm but firm. "It's the start of something better." The words felt heavy, laden with the weight of expectation, but she held her ground. She knew the road ahead would be long and arduous, but she was prepared to walk it. The district attorney, Baldwin, a man who usually exuded an air of unflappable confidence, looked pale and shaken. He sat across from Alana in her chambers, his fingers drumming a nervous rhythm on the table. I never expected this," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. He'd known Holstead for years, seen his aggressive tactics, heard the whispers of misconduct. He'd chosen to look the other way. Convenient blindness, Alana thought, her gaze unwavering. "Either we clean this up now," she said, her voice cutting through the tension, "or we answer to it later on someone else's terms." The investigation into Holstead's actions quickly expanded. The slap, initially viewed as an isolated incident, became a gateway to uncovering a pattern of abuse. Other victims came forward, their stories echoing each other in a chilling symphony of injustice. Dashcam footage surfaced showing Holstead using excessive force during arrests, body cam recordings revealing a pattern of racial profiling. The internal affairs investigation, initially met with resistance from within the police department, gained momentum, fueled by public pressure and the mounting evidence. Alana spent her evenings poring over case files, cross-referencing names, dates, locations. She saw the threads of injustice woven into the fabric of the system, the subtle biases, the overlooked complaints, the systemic failures that allowed men like Holstead to operate with impunity. The weight of it pressed down on her, a crushing burden, but she refused to yield. She saw the faces of the victims in every document, heard their voices in every whispered testimony. This is for them, she thought, pushing through the exhaustion. This is how we honor their pain. The protests continued, growing in size and intensity. The streets of Austin echoed with chants of justice now and hold them accountable. Alana watched the news coverage, the images of the crowds a testament to the collective outrage. She felt a flicker of hope, a fragile ember in the darkness. This is the beginning, she thought, a quiet certainty settling in her heart. This is how we change the world. The city council, spurred by the public outcry and the mounting evidence of police misconduct, announced a series of reforms. Body cameras became mandatory for all officers. Civilian oversight boards were established. and new training programs were implemented focusing on de-escalation techniques and implicit bias. The changes weren't enough, not yet, but they were a start. They were a crack in the foundation of a broken system, a glimmer of light in the long, dark tunnel. Weeks turned into months. The initial frenzy of media attention subsided, replaced by a quieter, more determined effort to hold those responsible accountable. Holstead was fired, stripped of his badge, and indicted on multiple charges. The investigation continued, widening its scope to include other officers implicated in the systemic misconduct. Alana, back in her courtroom, felt the weight of her gavel differently now. It was a symbol not just of authority, but of responsibility. Each case she presided over, each decision she made, was a step towards building a more just and equitable system. The slap, the pain, the outrage, it had all been a catalyst, a painful but necessary catalyst for change. And as she looked out at the faces in her courtroom, she knew the work was far from over. But she also knew, with a certainty that settled deep within her bones, that they were moving in the right direction. They were building a better future, one brick at a time. The air in the courtroom, usually thick with the dust of precedent and the hushed whispers of anticipation, crackled with a different energy. Weeks had bled into one another, each day a slow drip of anxiety building towards this moment. Alana Merryweather sat, not on the bench this time, but in the gallery, a silent observer. The wood beneath her palms felt smooth, polished by countless hands grappling with justice, with truth. She felt the weight of it, the legacy of every verdict passed within these walls, pressing down on her. It wasn't the familiar pressure of responsibility she carried as a judge. This was something heavier, something born of violation and the arduous climb towards restitution. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, painting stripes across the worn carpet, a stark contrast to the shadowed corners where secrets seemed to fester. The ticking of the clock on the wall was amplified in the quiet expectancy, each tick a hammer blow against the fragile peace. Alana's gaze drifted to the defendant's table. Rick Holstead sat stiffly, his usual imposing presence diminished, his shoulders slumped under the weight of the charges. He avoided eye contact, his gaze fixed on some unseen point beyond the jury box. She wondered what went through his mind now. Stripped of his badge, his authority reduced to the orange jumpsuit he wore. Was it regret? Defiance? Or simply the cold realization of the consequences he had so carelessly invited? The district attorney, Baldwin, his voice resonant and measured, presented the case with an almost clinical detachment. Alana remembered the stunned disbelief on his face that day, the shock rippling through the courtroom like a seismic wave. Baldwin, a creature of the system himself, had initially seemed more concerned with restoring order than with addressing the root cause of the disruption. Now, weeks later, his demeanor reflected a grim understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the rot that had been festering beneath the polished surface of the law. He methodically laid out the evidence, the security footage, the testimonies of witnesses, each piece adding to the damning portrait of Holstead's actions. Alana found herself detached from the proceedings, watching it unfold as if through a pane of frosted glass. The slap echoed in her memory, a phantom sting on her cheek. She could still feel the heat of his hand, the hum of indignation that vibrated through her body. But the physical pain was a dull ache compared to the deeper wound, the insidious erosion of trust in the very system she had sworn to uphold. The defense attorney, a young woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, tried to paint a picture of a stressed officer, a momentary lapse in judgment, a reaction born of frustration. Her words, however, felt hollow, bouncing off the solid wall of evidence. Alana thought of the countless times she had heard similar excuses, the tired justifications for abuses of power. How many times had she, herself, been complicit in accepting these narratives, allowing the system to perpetuate its own failings? The young bailiff, the same one who had stood frozen that day, his youthful face etched with fear, now stood tall, his movements precise and confident. He met Alana's gaze for a fleeting moment, a silent acknowledgement of a shared experience, of a shift in power dynamics that had occurred within these walls. The jury's deliberation was short, their verdict swift and unanimous. Guilty on all counts. A wave of relief, almost palpable, washed over the courtroom. Alana felt it too, a loosening of the knot in her chest. But the relief was tinged with a profound sadness, a recognition of the damage done, the lives impacted by Holstead's unchecked arrogance. The judge, a stern-faced woman with silver threading through her dark hair, addressed Holstead directly. Her voice, usually calm and controlled, held a tremor of anger. She spoke of the sanctity of the court, the erosion of public trust, the responsibility that came with wearing a badge. Alana watched Holstead's face, searching for a flicker of remorse, a glimmer of understanding. But there was nothing, only a stony mask of defeat. The sentence was handed down, a just punishment for his crimes. But Alana knew that the true impact of that day extended far beyond the confines of this courtroom. In the weeks that followed, a ripple effect began to spread through the Austin Police Department and the judicial system. The slap, that single act of violence, had become a catalyst for change. Investigations were launched, internal reviews conducted, policies revised. The whispers of misconduct that had long circulated in the shadows were finally brought into the light. Alana, no longer just a judge, but a symbol of resistance, found herself at the forefront of this reform. She spoke at town halls, met with community leaders, testified before legislative committees. Her voice, once confined to the courtroom, now resonated throughout the city, a clarion call for accountability and transparency. She drew strength from the quiet nods of agreement, the shared stories of injustice whispered in hushed tones, the growing chorus of voices demanding change. It was a long, arduous process, fraught with resistance and setbacks. But with each small victory, each policy change, each instance of accountability, Alana felt a renewed sense of purpose, a reaffirmation of her belief in the power of justice. The road ahead was long, the fight far from over. But the seeds of change had been sown, and Alana Merryweather, once a silent observer, had become a driving force in shaping a more just and equitable future. The slap had echoed through the halls of justice, not as a symbol of defeat, but as a rallying cry for reform. And Alana, bearing the invisible scars of that day, would continue to fight, one case, one policy, one voice at a time. The heavy courthouse doors swung shut behind her, the sound echoing the finality of the gavel. The cool autumn air, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the courtroom, kissed Alana Merryweather's face. She inhaled deeply, the crispness a momentary reprieve from the suffocating tension that had coiled around her throat for the past hour. Her hand, the one that had stung from Holstead's impact, instinctively rose to her cheek. The physical pain was a dull throb, a distant echo compared to the roiling emotions churning within her. Disbelief warred with anger, a cold fury hardening her resolve. This wasn't just about a slap. It was about a system that allowed such blatant disrespect, a system she had sworn to uphold. A small group of law students, their faces etched with a mixture of awe and apprehension, waited on the courthouse steps. They had witnessed the unprecedented event, the ripple effect of the slap spreading through them like a current. Their youthful idealism, so palpable just moments before, seemed momentarily dimmed, replaced by the harsh reality of what they had just observed. Alana recognized that look, that flicker of disillusionment. She had seen it countless times reflected in the eyes of colleagues, in the weary sighs of seasoned lawyers. It was the look of hope slowly eroding under the weight of injustice. She paused, gathering herself, pushing down the weariness that threatened to consume her. These students, these future guardians of the law, needed to see more than just the ugliness. They needed to see the fight, the unwavering commitment to justice that burned within her, a fire that refused to be extinguished. Your Honor, one of the students, a young woman with bright, inquisitive eyes, stepped forward. Her voice was hesitant, laced with uncertainty. What would happen now? The question, so simple yet so profound, hung in the air. Alana looked at them, at the faces that held the future of the legal system. She saw their vulnerability, their yearning for guidance in a world that had just shown them its darkest side. Her own doubt flickered. Could she truly offer them hope, when the very foundations of justice seemed so fragile? This isn't the end. Alana's voice, though quiet, resonated with an unexpected strength. She felt a surge of determination, the weight of the moment settling into a quiet resolve. Each word she spoke was a carefully placed stone, rebuilding the crumbling wall of their faith. It's the beginning. Internally, she wrestled with the truth of her words. Beginnings were fragile, susceptible to the same corrosive forces that had led to this very moment. But beginnings also held the promise of change, of a different future. A future where a slap in open court wouldn't be a symbol of power, but a testament to its demise. What we witnessed today, she continued, her gaze sweeping over the group, wasn't just an isolated incident. It was the culmination of years of unchecked power, a system that has allowed individuals like Officer Holstead to operate with impunity. The students shifted uneasily, their youthful optimism battling with the stark reality Alana presented. She understood their discomfort. It was the discomfort of confronting a truth that challenged their carefully constructed ideals. It was the discomfort that preceded growth. I've documented these abuses for years, Alana confessed, a flicker of pain crossing her face. The memory of countless ignored reports, of dismissed complaints, weighed heavily on her. The casual racism, the excessive force, the disregard for due process, it's a pattern woven into the very fabric of our justice system. She paused, her gaze locking with the student who had spoken earlier. And it's a pattern we have to break. The young woman nodded slowly, her eyes wide with a dawning understanding. Alana saw the initial hesitation replaced by a spark of resolve, a flicker of the same fire that burned within her. This isn't just about Officer Holstead. Alana's voice rose slightly, carrying on the wind. It's about holding the entire system accountable. It's about demanding transparency, demanding reform. It's about changing the narrative, rewriting the rules. She felt a surge of hope, a fragile bud pushing through the hardened ground of despair. These students, these witnesses to injustice, were not just passive observers. They were the seeds of change, waiting to be nurtured, waiting to bloom. If we want different outcomes, Alana's voice resonated with a newfound conviction. We have to demand different systems. We have to challenge the status quo, question the narratives we've been fed, and refuse to accept anything less than true justice. The students, no longer hesitant, leaned in, absorbing her words like thirsty earth drinking in the rain. Their faces, though still marked by the shock of what they had witnessed, held a newfound determination, a glimmer of hope rekindled. This isn't the end, Alana repeated, the words echoing her own internal mantra. It's the start of something better. But it's a start that requires each and every one of us to be vigilant, to speak truth to power, and to never, ever give up the fight. The silence that followed was not the silence of defeat, but the silence of contemplation, of a seed taking root. Alana looked at the students, at the future reflected in their eyes, and knew, with a certainty that transcended the pain and the weariness, that the fight was far from over. It had just begun.